and exploring how some people will accept you for exactly who you are and others you end up having to fight them for it, and it's a battle that is exhausting and unfair, but in this case it works out. Hello my loves, and thank you for joining me. It's Kirsten. I've compiled a little stack of books that I think have some great representation in that I've really enjoyed, and don't forget to get involved and mention some other ones that you think are brilliant in the comments below, because the more recommendations we have the better it is. Now let's just get on with the books. So the first one that I wanted to talk about is Foul is Fair by Hannah Cappin. I really enjoyed this book. If you've been here on my channel for last year, you'd know that I was gushing about this, and I think it's amazing. This is a retelling of Macbeth. I really enjoyed this book, and I think it's done really well. We're following our main character, and she is raped. She resolves to get her revenge on the boys that did this. Oh gosh, does she? I think it's done really well. I really enjoyed it. I think it's just such a great book for like women taking power for themselves, getting their own back. Just really good book. Really good. And we do have a trans character within this, and also possibly bi. It's not something that they talk about explicitly within this book, but you definitely do have two of the girls in this friendship group that have feelings for each other, and one of them is transgender, and I love it. Our main character is so protective of our friend, always been of the opinion that she is a girl no matter what, and it doesn't matter what other people think, and I just think the friendship circle in this is amazing. I love this book. I think it's brilliant. It is, as it says on the back, fierce, vicious and electric, an unapologetic feminist battle cry, and it really is that throughout this book. Honestly, I think I'm due a reread, plus this cover is just to die for. I love it. Then we have another transgender representation book, and that's Christina Henry's Horseman. I really enjoyed this one. Christina Henry does a lot of horror retellings, and generally speaking she's very inclusive with her books in terms of the community, and I really enjoyed this one. This is one of her this is her newest book. We are following the tale of the Headless Horseman, Sleepy Hollow, just a reimagining of that tale, which I thought was really well done. And then our main character, Ben, is struggling to deal with the fact that Ben is a boy. That is who he is, but his grandmother doesn't agree, and she's always like, stop messing around, you're a girl, you're going to behave this way. And then by the end of the book, perspectives in that have changed, and Ben can be accepted for who Ben actually is. I really liked it for that book, and a lot of this, as much as you do have the retelling of the Headless Horseman, a lot of it is exploring that, and exploring how some people will accept you for exactly who you are, and others you end up having to fight them for it, and it's a battle that is exhausting and unfair, but in this case it works out, and Ben is accepted for who he is, and I liked that tale. I really think it was a really well written tale, very lyrical, and it has a really good atmosphere, so this is a great one if you're interested in like horror fantasy. I have tried mixing up the genres here, so I think I forgot to mention, but Foul is Fair is more following a group of school kids that are going to a school. One of them gets raped, and then they get their revenge and everything, and yeah, so this is more like contemporary setting, whereas this one is definitely a fantasy. There are some horror elements to this book. Some of the writing and depictions and stuff that go in are a bit gruesome, but it is well done, and I do think representation is throughout this book, and the struggles because of when this book is set, the time period of how it wasn't acceptable back then. Then we have a fantasy book, an adult fantasy, and a recent favourite of mine, and that is Mask of Mirrors by M.A. Carrick, and this one is just chock full of representation. It's normal because it's just part of their world. Nobody belittles anyone for it. You don't have to fight for who you're going to be. It's just accepted. Whether you're into men or women or anything in between, they don't care. They also don't care how you identify yourself as a man or a woman, and I think it was really nice just to have it be a natural part of the world, not something that was made to be like, oh look at this, or we have this representation within this book, but just natural. and nobody was questioning it, nobody was giving our characters a hard time for it. I think it was really well done. So in this one we're following Ren. Ren is a con artist and she is conning her way into the high society so that she no longer has to be a beggar and she can look after her sister, because as far as she's concerned they deserve it. Alongside that you have magic that's going on. A lot of this book is a bit slower. It's more about the politics, about the society and how it's all broken down into different class structures. You do have a lot of that sort of like class separation within this book, but none of that is centered around what your sexual preference is or anything like that, or who you identify as, which I liked in this book. And this kind of reminds me of like a Victorian era setting but with magic and everything involved, and just loved it. I thought it was great. One of my favourites. I have been gushing about it recently. Then we have the 5th season by N.K. Jemisin, and this is an amazing book. It's loads of representation and just purely a brilliant book. So this is more like a dystopian fantasy sci-fi crossover and it's fantastic. A lot of people have been talking about this book on BookTube, and for good reason, because it really is very well written. We do have a lot of different representation. We have transgender, we have bisexual, we have polyamorous relationships going on, that you name it, it's probably got it in here, and I like that. Again, it's inclusive. Nobody actually cares about it. So I really appreciate it when books do just have it as a natural part of their society. And that's exactly what this one does. Now, as I said, this is a more of a dystopian one where it's set in our world but several years into the future, and there are basically massive earthquakes that every so often will just rip the world apart. Society has changed to the point where that is what they're built upon. It's a very strict society because everything is to do with survival. There are some really difficult, dark moments in this book as well. It's a trilogy. All 3 of them are quite dark. It does get a bit more science heavy towards the last 2, which I found a bit more difficult because science fiction isn't generally my sort of genre, but it does explain a lot more of this world. I think it's really good, really well written, and definitely deserves the Hugo Award for every single book in this trilogy, which is the first time that's ever happened, and rightly so. I think it's fantastic and would highly recommend. Well, obviously I would recommend all of these books. Then we have a classic, and that's Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. Now this one is more inferred and not strictly brought to light. I can definitely say that Rebecca herself as a character who is dead throughout this book, but you can say that she was very, from what I was reading, I read it as she's bi. She doesn't care about whether you're a man or a woman, she just has her enjoyment and will take that. And then I do believe her maid in this was very much in love with her, and I do think that's more sapphic. Obviously this is a classic, so the way it's written is not explicit, and it is written in a way where it wasn't deemed as appropriate, but it is still there. So if you are looking for a classic book with that representation, then Rebecca I think is a good one for it. This is a gothic literary classic book, which I think is, I really enjoyed. It's one of those books that do get recommended. If you like Jane Eyre, read this book, and vice versa. Fantastic, really loved it. We're following our main character whose name you never know, and I think that really adds to this story because she is feeling like there is the ghost of her husband's previous wife Rebecca that just lingers and overshadows her, and not knowing her name really adds to that. And we're just following her as she goes to her home for the first time and all the difficulties that she has because everyone remembers Rebecca and is constantly comparing her to Rebecca, and the mystery of how she died and everything. It's very well done. I really liked it. As I said, the representation isn't at the forefront of this book, but I believe can be inferred if you look for it. And then a book where it's definitely at the forefront, we have These Violent Delights by Micah Nevermore, and this is a gay romance book, but a very dark one. This is a book that I would say for me is going to be better on reread. I found this to be a really dark, disturbing book, kind of like Dark Academia in a way, but we're following these 2 boys as they become obsessed with each other, and you see how this obsession becomes really toxic. It's one of those books that when I finished reading it I wasn't sure how I felt, but the more I've been thinking about it, the more I think I really liked it, and I think I'm going to prefer it upon reread. I actually picked this one up because of Ashley from A Follow Up Crew Fiction. It's one of her favourite books. Rightly so, it is very good, but trigger warnings because it is a dark, toxic relationship that these boys just can't seem to live without each other, and it just gets very, very twisted and just extremely dark by the end of this book. So trigger warnings for that, but it was really interesting, and I really liked the depiction of this toxic relationship, how it started off with one of our characters, Paul, feeling very isolated and alone, not feeling like he's good enough. Julian can't possibly love him. Julian deserves so much better, and Paul just constantly putting himself down, to then seeing how this just grows into such a toxic relationship. And maybe the person that is the dangerous person isn't the person you think it is. Which is very vague, but I want to keep it that way because that's kind of how I feel about this book. So yeah, really good. Gay romance. There is difficulty with coming out, so Paul coming out and being gay and having that because of his family and his religion. They aren't that supportive of it. Even his neighbours and stuff get a bit like, oh my god, I can't believe. So there is that to deal with in this book as well, so please be aware of that. I would recommend looking up the trigger warnings for this book, but even though it was a dark book, it's one that's just stayed with me. Then another classic, we have Orlando by Virginia Woolf, and I loved this book. I mean, honestly, cover, gorgeous. And this has transgender representation, and I love that. We're following our main character, who is a young man, Orlando, and I'm going to admit, this book is a little bit trippy at times as well. But he then starts identifying as a woman. He does this trip away, and there's this whole thing where he has... Well, you're not sure if it's like magical realism or not within this book, in all honesty. But after that point, starts identifying as a woman. And then you find that throughout the book, they change their mind on a daily basis, whether they want to be a woman that day or a man that day. Like, they have a fluid gender identity is probably the better way of saying it. And I really like it. I also like the struggles that Orlando has because of the fact that as a man, he has his properties and everything, but as a woman, she doesn't have that entitlement, and so she has to fight for it and prove that, well, I'm still the same person. These are still my properties. This is still my own. I do not need to be married to have this. It's really interesting. I think it does a really good look at gender identities, gender roles back then, and also clothing, how you can use it to identify yourself. I really liked it. I think it's really, really good, and I would honestly say probably the best representation that I've seen within a classic book. Sorry, I didn't really say what this book was too much about, but I think it's got the best bit on the back. One of the 20th century's defining imaginings of queer identity, Orlando is a book of radical possibilities, boy and girl, past and future, nature and magic, life and history. A thrilling love letter and a feminist classic, it trespasses over the borders of place, time and self. I think that does a much better explanation of it than I do. And then finally we have Red, White and Royal Blue, which is another book I've gushed about recently, and this is a gay romance, which I absolutely love. But we don't just have gay romance in here, we do have bisexual representation, sapphic. There's a lot in this book, and I think it's really well done. This is by Casey McQuiston, and I loved it. This was my first ever contemporary romance book, and what a way to start. I think it's fantastic. I really loved this book, and on the back it gives you everything you need to know. What happens when America's first son falls in love with the Prince of Wales. And that is the two characters that we're following. We are following mainly the perspective of Alex, who is the son of America's president, and he doesn't like the Prince of Wales. But they meet at this wedding, and an alteration happens where they end up destroying this £75,000 wedding cake, and so they have to do damage control. They have to show that they're actually best friends and they were just messing around, and then from there the romance blossoms. So they kind of go from enemies to friends to lovers, and then also you're dealing with the fallout of them being in a relationship, the fact that the Prince of Wales is gay, the fact that Alex is bisexual, and what impact it has on the politics and everything for that. Now, one of the major criticisms for this book that I've seen is that it's too happy, that it's not real life, and it isn't, because it's in an alternate version of our world. But I like the fact that it's so hopeful and lovely, and maybe this is something that eventually we will aspire to have. I think it would be lovely if it was possible. But yeah, this one just gives me a heartwarming vibe. It's one of my favourite books. It's just a comfort read and I adore it. So there we have it. These are all the books that I think have really good representation within them. I've tried keeping it over several different genres, so hopefully there's something for everyone in this. I have also done this video last year as well, so I'll have that linked in the description below if you're interested. Making sure that none of those books cross over, so I watched that video a few times to make sure. But I'm really pleased with all of these books. Really enjoyed all of them, and as I said, I think the representation is done really well. But please let me know if you have any other book that you think have great representation. But there we go, that was the video for today. So I think today let's put some hearts. Whatever your personal pride flag is, let's put it in hearts below. I think that would be lovely. But for now, if you have enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it that thumbs up, subscribe, comment to let me know that you're here. Social media links will be linked below, and I will of course catch you in the next one.